have a copy placed up on our FCS YouTube channel. So thank you for joining us today. My name's Darren Paskey with the DBHR HCA team. And I'm also working today with our Home and Community Services team to provide a lot of information today, particularly around trauma-informed care for supportive employment. Today we have a few folks from the HCLA team. We got Sammy Bernard and Nick Manouche today that will be providing the presentation. And if you do have questions, please put those in the chat. We'll be able to collect those and address the answers at the end of today's presentation. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Nick.
Great. Thank you, Darren. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar training, whatever connotation we're going to use. I'm going to be talking to you today about, as it says there on the screen, supporting FCS participants experiencing psychosis. And so that's going to be kind of the primary piece there I'm going to be discussing today. How do we manage folks, or how do we help folks who may be experiencing a psychosis in a supported employment program? So I want to usually start out these types of trainings really talking about like why we're here. And I think that's pretty important because the reason this topic matters is because staff, like all of you here, are often in the middle of very complicated situations. You may be working with someone who truly wants a job, wants income, wants independence, or, frankly, just wants their current job, but at the same time, they might be experiencing symptoms that make the process feel unsafe or threatening to them. For example, maybe the person believes a supervisor is targeting them. Maybe they think coworkers are talking about them. They may believe their phone is being monitored or that providers are part of a larger plan against them. Now, from our perspective, those beliefs may not match reality, but from the person's perspective, the fear is very real. And that's the key starting point I want to put out there. We don't have to agree with the belief to understand that the person is distressed and feeling that distress is very real. And frankly, our job, all of your jobs, is to respond to the distress in a way that protects trust and keeps the door open. And that can be a very difficult thing to do. And it's what we're going to kind of walk through in today's webinar. So first and foremost, before I get too much into the content, I usually like to do this, especially when we talk about mental health topics. So I really want to be clear about the scope. The information I'm presenting in this webinar is really not about diagnosing psychosis. It's not about providing therapy. It's really not about deciding whether someone has schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, trauma-related symptoms, substance-related symptoms, or just something else, really. Instead, this is about supported employment staff like yourselves and what you can do within your roles. You can listen. You can support, you can help identify goals, you can notice functional changes, and you can create a practical plan. You can coordinate with other providers when appropriate, and frankly, you can document what you observe, and you can follow through with your agency's crisis or safety protocols, wherever you might be hailing from. Now, the focus today is something that I want to keep very practical. When a person is scared, suspicious, or declining support, how do we avoid making it worse? How do we keep working toward the person's employment goals? And so with that, let me talk to you today a little bit about some of our objectives. On the screen here are the main goals for today. First, I want to talk to you about reduced insight. And that means the person may not recognize the symptoms are symptoms. And this matters because if we assume the person is simply being difficult, we're probably going to respond in a way that increases conflict. Second, we're going to practice non-confrontational communication. Some of you have probably heard of the technique that I'm going to be introducing a little bit later. I hope you have. This will be a nice rehash if we can talk about it in this particular context. But all that said, this doesn't mean we're going to be passive. It means we're going to be strategic. Third one there, validation. We're going to talk about how to validate feelings without reinforcing inaccurate beliefs. And this is really the sweet spot. How do we keep things moving forward in a safe manner and keep everybody engaged? Number 4 there, planning. We're going to build a shared job support plan. Now, this is the practical tool that helps us move from, well, frankly, conversation into action. And I'm going to be giving Darren a handout that's he'll distribute to all of you, which will kind of run through each of the steps I'm going to be talking about in today's webinar. And then finally, we're going to talk about when the situation is moving beyond routine employment support and needs behavioral health coordination, crisis support, or just another level of response. So those are our objectives for today. One of the first things I want to start with, though, is, well, a core question. Basically, that common stuck point. How do we create a plan when the person declines services because they don't believe anything is wrong or because their symptoms are telling them that the services are unsafe? And this is where many providers, many case managers, many folks in general just get stuck. The instinct is to explain, right? We want to explain this is not happening, or your supervisor is not targeting you, or no one is watching you, or you need to accept help. And that instinct truthfully makes sense. We're trying to be helpful, but in these moments, explaining reality often doesn't work. It makes the person feel judged, dismissed, controlled, or even suspicious. So the question becomes, well, if we can't argue the person into agreement, what can we do instead? And that's what leads us to this. Supported employment providers, case managers, the whole shebang have a powerful role, but you also have a very specific role. You're often the person helping translate hopes into real-life steps, applications, interviews, job retention, workplace communication, transportation, schedules, benefit concerns, even supports. And that means you're not responsible for treating psychosis, but you are responsible for responding skillfully when symptoms affect employment. And so a helpful way to think about it is this. We don't need to solve the person's entire clinical picture. We need, though, to understand how the current situation is affecting the person's employment goals and what support can help reduce those barriers. So instead of asking, how do I prove this belief is wrong? We want to ask, how is this affecting work, safety, communication, trust, or just plain old follow through? That shift really changes the entire conversation. And the key thing here is that's also very trauma informed. It's frankly one of the core principles of trauma informed care, because we want to move away from the question of, what is wrong with the person to the question of what has happened or happening to the person. But with that, before we get too deep into this, I need to talk to you a little bit about psychosis, and I want to make sure I define it pretty clearly. I want you to keep in mind, a psychosis is not a single thing. It's a collection of experiences where a person's thoughts, perceptions, or sense of reality may be disrupted. Many of you are probably very familiar with this, either through direct clinical work, ancillary clinical work, just working in general. But I really want to characterize it like this. That can include paranoia, delusional beliefs, hallucinations, intense fear, or thoughts that become hard to organize for the individual. So, in an employment setting, that may show up as mistrust, avoidance, or conflict, maybe sudden quitting, missed meetings, refusal of supports, that kind of thing. The point, though, is this. The person's experience may feel completely real to them. So, that doesn't mean we agree with the belief. It just means we respect their emotional response is frankly based on what they're experiencing. If someone truly believes they're being watched or targeted, that fear makes sense from inside that experience. And that's something that I'm sure you probably heard before. I know I've heard it till I'm blue in the face. It's hard to live though. And it's hard to keep that boundary as you're working with individuals who might be experiencing a psychosis. But we'll get through that here in a second. Let's talk a little bit about what this can look like at work. Now, here are just some examples of what you might hear. A person may say their supervisor is trying to get them fired. They may believe coworkers are secretly communicating about them. They may feel cameras, phones, or computers are being used to track them. And that may become suspicious of you as a case manager, as staff, as somebody working with them. And again, the goal is not to debate whether these things are true. The goal is truthfully to identify the functional impact. Is the person missing shifts, avoiding interviews, quitting jobs suddenly, getting into conflict with coworkers, refusing meetings, not sleeping, feeling unsafe at work, that kind of thing? Supported employment planning, as you all will know, works best when we focus on function, like what is happening, what's getting harder, and what might help the person continue moving forward toward their employment goal. So, one important concept is reduced insight. as it relates directly to the psychosis. Now, sometimes a person experiencing psychosis doesn't recognize what they're experiencing may be connected to a mental health condition. And so this isn't always denial, right? This can seem like denial on the outside, but it's not. Denial is more like, I know this can be true, but I can't emotionally face it. Reduced insight, though, can be different. The person may genuinely not perceive anything is wrong. And that matters because if we approach the person as if they're simply refusing to cooperate, well, we may become frustrated or directive or just confrontational without even intending to. And so a better shift is this. Move from how do I convince this person to how do I connect with this person and build a plan around what they care about. And connection comes first there. Planning comes second. In fact, think of it like this, trying to plan without trust is like it's like building IKEA furniture with no screws. Anybody who's ever bought IKEA furniture or anything off of Amazon probably knows exactly what I mean. It's definitely possible in your imagination, but incredibly frustrating in real life. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about reduced insight here. So with that, let's talk a little bit about arguing, because arguing usually backfires because the person is just not is not simply missing information. If someone believes they're being watched, giving them more facts may not help. In fact, it may make them feel like you're part of the problem. So when we argue, we often accidentally communicate things like, I don't believe you, or I don't understand you, and I'm going to decide what is real for you. Now, we may not exactly say those words, but the undertone can be there. And that can increase fear and defensiveness. Instead, we want to make sure we're asking these kinds of questions like, what is underneath this belief? Is the person scared, embarrassed, angry, exhausted, feeling unsafe, feeling controlled, worried about losing their job? That emotional layer gives us something we can respond to without agreeing with the inaccurate belief. And as you see there on the screen, we want, instead of asking, how do I prove this is not true? Ask, what feeling or need is underneath this? Now with that comes validation, or validating feelings, not false beliefs. And this is that sort of sweet spot that I was talking about at the beginning here. This is one of the most important skills that I could possibly be talking about today. Because validating doesn't mean saying, yes, your supervisor is definitely plotting against you. That would reinforce the belief. It also doesn't mean saying, well, this is ridiculous, you're paranoid. That frankly damages trust. A more powerful response is frankly, I can hear how stressful this feels. I'm not seeing it in the same way, but I do want to understand what would help you feel safer getting through the workday. Now that sentence that I just laid out really does a lot if you think about it. It acknowledges the person's distress, true. It also avoids agreeing with the belief. It gently also names that you have a different perspective, and it redirects towards function and planning. That's the zone we want to stay in. Again, we want to say something like, I can hear how stressful this feels. I'm not seeing it the same way, but I do want to understand what you're experiencing and what would help you feel safer getting through your workday. That's the sweet spot. And it's hard to make that something that's instinctual. It's, some of the same things we try to teach people in terms of like practice and practice and practice, sometimes we have to do ourselves. And this is the point where I want to introduce you to this core communication framework. It's referred to as LEAP. Some of you may have heard of it before. I hope you have. It's a fantastic communication tool. And LEAP stands for, as you see on the screen there, listen, empathize, agree, and partner. So it's a fantastic framework, as I keep saying. And it's helpful because it gives a structure when conversations feel messy or emotionally charged. When someone says that sounds irrational or alarming, our brains often want to jump straight to correction or problem solving. But this communication framework helps slows us down. First, we listen, okay? What is the person actually saying? What matters to them? Pay attention to not only their verbal communication, but also their nonverbal communication. Second, we want to make sure we empathize, as I was mentioning a little bit earlier. What emotion is underneath all of this? We don't have to have a perfect idea. We just have to be open to seeing what's underneath there. And third, agree. Where's the common ground? Maybe you don't agree about the belief, but you can agree that they want to feel safe, keep their job, avoid conflict, or just have more control. And then finally, fourth, partner. I mean, basically, the question around here is, what's one next step that we can take together? You can listen, you can empathize, you can agree till you're blue in the face, but if you don't have a good next best step, well, the first three really are for naught. Now, this is the LEAP method in a nutshell. What I want to do right now is I'm going to show you a brief video on what that all means. Okay? And in this video, it comes directly from the LEAP Institute. It's called When a Loved One Refuses Treatment. And again, LEAP stands for Listen, Empathize, Agree, and Partner. And it was originally developed by Dr. Javier Amador as a communication approach for really building trust with someone who may not believe they need treatment or support. Now, as you watch this, I want you to pay attention to the overall stance being modeled. The goal is not to argue, it's not to correct or force treatment. The goal is simply to slow down, listen carefully, respond to the person's emotions, find areas of shared agreement, and then partner around a next best step. Now, even though the video I'm going to show you is framed around a loved one refusing treatment, the same general communication principles can apply to supported employment and working with clients who may be experiencing a psychosis. We may not be talking with a family member, and well, we are not providing clinical treatment, right? But we are often trying to preserve trust with someone who may be scared, suspicious, or just declining services. So as you watch this, I want you to think about how this approach could translate into your role. What does it look like to listen without immediately correcting? What does it sound like to validate distress without agreeing with an accurate belief? And truthfully, how might we use this same approach to keep the person connected to their employment goals? Okay, so give me just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and bring this up for you.
When a loved one refuses treatment, LEAP approach. Coping with a loved one's refusal of treatment for a severe mental health issue can be a challenging experience. Often, caregivers, despite their good intentions, find themselves perceived as enemies rather than allies by the very individuals they want to support. Rather than dismissing this resistance as denial, it's essential to recognize that the person may be grappling with a lack of insight into their condition. A common symptom known as anosognosia is a lack of awareness stems from problems with the frontal lobes of the brain. Typically occurring in severe mental health conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Caregivers play a key role by adopting specific communication techniques that foster a sense of partnership and friendship with their loved ones experiencing a lack of insight. Dr. Xavier Amador, clinical psychologist and author of I Am Not Sick, I Don't Need Help, created the LEAP approach after and published research on it successfully assisting his brother, who had anosognosia as a symptom of his schizophrenia, in accepting treatment. This approach aims to establish trust and lower resistance to help the individual find their own motivation to embrace treatment. The acronym LEAP refers to 4 key components of the approach: listen, empathize, agree, and partner. This foundational communication tool involves actively listening to the person with the mental health condition, working towards understanding their reality and perspective. Asking non-judgmental questions and reflecting back their thoughts contributes to an atmosphere of respect. It is also possible for the caregiver to learn different tools that will help them to know when and how to give an opinion, and to show humility by apologizing when necessary. Feeling heard and acknowledged paves the way for the individual to be more receptive to hearing advice. Recognizing and acknowledging the various emotions that may underlie a person's refusal of treatment, be it fear, insecurity, or anger, builds a bridge of empathy. It is important to normalize their feelings by letting them know that in their situation, anyone would feel the same. By understanding their feelings, caregivers can address concerns more effectively, fostering openness to discussions about their condition. Despite seeming improbable, finding common ground is crucial. Identifying shared facts and highlighting areas of agreement helps the person express reasons why treatment could benefit them. This phase allows for subtle suggestions without directly addressing the mental health issue. Even with a lack of insight regarding their mental health condition, it is possible for them to find a good reason to seek treatment, such as wanting to improve their situation by finding a job or engaging in specific activities. It will become the objective that both parties will be able to work towards. It involves establishing a collaborative partnership centered around the shared objective. By utilizing the points of agreement, the caregiver and the individual can work together to explore solutions that will contribute to positive changes for the loved one's mental health. While individuals with severe mental health conditions may perceive life differently, the LEAP approach emphasizes the importance of respecting and acknowledging their reality. It shifts the focus from arguments, education, and disapproval towards emotional connection, validating feelings, and expressing care and concern without imposing an agenda. The approach facilitates a dialogue that promotes problem solving and collaboration, fortifying relationships on the path to recovery.
All right. So what I really appreciate about this video is that it shifts the focus away from the concept of winning the argument toward protecting the relationship. And that's a really important distinction. When someone's experiencing paranoia, delusional thinking, or reduced insight, as I mentioned, the conversation can easily turn into a debate about what is real. And once we get pulled into that debate, we often lose the person. So they may feel dismissed, judged, controlled, or threatened, even if our intention is to help. Now, the LEAP approach gives us a different path. First, as the video mentioned, we listen. That means we slow down and try to understand what the person is experiencing. Then we empathize. We respond to the feeling underneath the belief, such as fear, frustration, embarrassment, or exhaustion. And then we look for agreement. Not agreement with the delusion or inaccurate belief, as I mentioned, but agreement around something shared, like wanting to feel safe, wanting more control, wanting steady income, or just wanting to avoid conflict. And then finally, we partner around one next best step. Now, for supported employment providers, this is especially useful because we don't need the person to agree with our interpretation of the situation before we can support their employment goal. We can still ask, well, what would help work feel more manageable? Or what is one step you'd be willing to try this week? Or how can we make sure you don't lose progress toward the job you want? Now, all that being said, the main takeaway I hope you're pulling from this part is this. We can validate the person's distress without reinforcing an inaccurate belief. We can stay respectful without pretending we agree. And most of all, we can keep the conversation focused on connection, dignity, and those practical next steps that I mentioned. Now, listening is one of the core pieces of all of this. And listening sounds pretty simple. But in these situations, not so easy, right? When someone says something that doesn't match reality, it can be uncomfortable. In fact, we can get kind of that uneasy feeling sometimes. And so we may want to correct it immediately or respond to it in a way that may not be received well. But early correction usually shuts the conversation down, and that's what we want to avoid. And so listening doesn't mean agreeing. Again, listening means gathering information to understand the person's experience, emotion, and goal. And so some of the things you might say instead of, your first instinct might be, tell me more about what's happening, or what feels most concerning right now, or how is this affecting your work? You want to engage them in a dialogue about what they're experiencing, how they're experiencing it, even if it sounds, well, frankly ridiculous, as I mentioned. It's not really the point. Our interpretation isn't the point. What they're experiencing is real for them. And we need to make sure that we're taking time to live in that world for a moment. And so noticing these questions don't challenge the belief. They help us understand the practical impact. An employment-focused question is especially useful too, like how is this affecting work? That moves the conversation from debating reality into identifying what support might actually be needed. And so let's go back and talk about empathize, because empathy is where we respond to the emotional reality. Even if the belief is inaccurate, folks, the feeling is real. If the person feels afraid, dismissed, watched, targeted, or unsafe, we can respond to that. For example, if the person says, my coworkers are sending secret messages about me, we don't need to say, yes, they are. We also don't need to say, no, they're not. We can say, though, that sounds really stressful, or I can see why you would feel edged or feel on edge if if that's what it feels like. The phrase, if that is what it feels like, can be useful because it validates the person's experience without confirming the content. And remember, empathy lowers defensiveness. It helps the person feel heard, feel seen. And when people feel heard and seen, they're more likely to stay engaged. It's not a one for one, mind you. It's not like you do it and then boom, you're done. This is something that you have to be consistent with through every interaction. Even when sometimes the other interactions the person is having or experiencing outside of the relationship you have with them is a little adverse. Now, the next piece is agree. And this part can feel incredibly tricky because when we say agree, we don't mean agreeing with the delusional belief. We mean finding a piece of shared ground. Maybe we can agree that the person wants to feel safe. Maybe we can agree that they want fewer conflicts at work. And maybe we can agree that they want income, independence, or control over their life. And so here's a useful phrase that I tend to think about. We may see the situation differently, but I think we both want to feel safe and be able to keep moving toward work, toward a shared goal. That phrase is honest. I see it as honest and I see it as genuine because it's true. It doesn't pretend you believe something you don't believe, but it also doesn't turn the conversation into a debate. And remember, agreement gives us a bridge to planning. And this is where we can partner. Partnering is where we move from that conversation into action piece that I was talking about earlier. Now, the key is to move to the next best small step. So when someone is distressed or mistrustful, a huge plan can feel overwhelming or threatening. So we don't want to lay out all 50 pages of the plan all at once, right? For example, like instead of saying, you need to accept all these services, we might say, what is one thing we could try this week that would make work feel a little bit more manageable? And that could be a check-in. That could be writing down triggers. It could be practicing how to talk with a supervisor, or it could be identifying one support that the person is willing to try. Because the next step should feel like an experiment. Like, let's try this next best step based on the information we gathered. But it should be a partner, a collaboration. It shouldn't be a demand. And so that's where the empathy piece that I talked about earlier and the agreement should come first before we try to partner with them. Now, here on this slide, I kind of give you a few scripts you can use in this moment. And in the handout that you'll get, I've sort of laid this out a little bit more clearly than you see on the screen. But all in all, the goal is not to sound robotic. We don't want to sound like we're an automaton or that we're reading off a script or anything like that. The goal is just to have language ready so you don't have to invent the perfect sentence while someone is upset. Because there's no such thing as the perfect sentence, right? So maybe the first script or the first sort of structure you could follow is something like this, like, I can tell this feels very real and stressful for you. This acknowledges the person's experience. The second piece, or the second possible structure you could use is something like, I'm not experiencing it that way, but I want to understand how it's affecting you. This avoids agreement while staying respectful. Like, I don't get it, but help me understand where you're at. The third one is just one of my favorites, to be honest, because we could say, I don't want to argue about what is true. I want to help you feel safer and keep moving toward your goal. Now that sentence gets you out of the debate and back to work, straightforward and as quickly as possible. And again, these will all be in the handout that you'll receive after this webinar. Now here is something that comes up very often and is a question that I'm sure like many people have when someone declines support. What happens? it's easy to label it as non-compliance, right? Uncooperative. I'm sure there's a whole plethora of different words we can assign to that. But those labels usually don't help us understand what's happening. There are many reasons someone may decline support. Many of you probably already well aware. They may be afraid. They may mistrust providers. They may feel ashamed. They may have had a bad experience with systems. They may be confused. They may not believe that they need help, or maybe they may feel like services are being forced on them when they don't feel like they actually need them. Now, the response we give, whether you're provider, case manager, whatnot, is curiosity before correction. Okay? Instead of saying you need this service, we might ask, like, what concerns you most about the support? Or what would make this feel less stressful? Or is there any part of that plan that does feel useful to you? Any of this? Curiosity keeps the door open, and we want to keep that door open for as long as possible. Because it could be for any of the reasons that you see on the screen there: fear, mistrust, shame and stigma, a trauma history, past negative experiences with providers or case managers, confusion or disorganization, reduced insight, as I spoke about before, or feeling pressured or controlled. And again, that's very subjective to the person. And so when we start with that empathy, when we start with that agreement, we build the bridge, we lay the foundation for trust, and then we can move into planning. Now, sometimes the phrase care plan can feel, well, frankly, fairly clinical, or even threatening to someone who doesn't believe they need services. So for here in this training, in this webinar, we're translating the idea into a shared job support plan. And that tone really matters, at least I believe so. Because a plan shouldn't feel like it's a list of everything the person is doing wrong. It should feel like a compliance contract. It shouldn't feel like a trap. Okay. Now, a shared job support plan should feel like a practical tool that says, here's your goal, here's what gets in the way, here's what helps, here's what we can try next, as I'm sure all of you well know. But that can sometimes get a little iffy when we're managing or when we're helping folks who may be experiencing a psychosis. And so adhering to this framework that I'm talking about here is much more likely to preserve that dignity and that participation in the plan. And so, a traditional care plan, as you see on the screen, may feel like, here's what you need to do. Here are the services you should accept. Here's what's wrong. Here's what's right. A shared job plan should feel like, here's what matters to you. Here's what gets in the way. Here's what helps. Here's what we can try next. This, again, moves away from that trauma-informed dichotomy in terms of those two questions I mentioned earlier, in terms of like what is wrong with the person, moving more towards what is happening or what has happened to the person. And that matters a lot because it makes them feel like they have the autonomy, they have the control over their life. And that's something that we want to cultivate. So here are the sections of a sort of a shared job support plan. Now, this doesn't need to be complicated, right? In fact, the simpler the better, frankly. If the plan is too long, no one's going to use it. And frankly, the plan should answer just a few basic questions like, what does the person want? What strengths can we build on? What gets harder when when symptoms or stress increases? What are some early warning signs that things are staring or really starting to go sideways? And what helps? How does the person prefer to communicate? That's a pretty big one. So maybe they prefer to communicate via email. Maybe they prefer to communicate via video chat like this. Maybe it's some other method. That's their preferred method is the method we want to start with. And other questions might be like, who's doing what? What's the next step? How and when do we need additional support? This is a practical planning tool. We'll put it like that, not a clinical assessment. So each one of these components that you see on the screen here, employment goals, strengths and preferences, functional impacts, early warning signs, triggers and stressors, communication preferences, support strategies, team roles and content and next steps, all of this, even the referral plan, is part of that shared job support plan. Now, the first section is the employment goal. So always start with what the person wants, not what we want for them, not what the system wants, not what would make our paperwork easier, but just what the person wants. Sometimes the goal is big, like I want a full-time job. Fantastic, right? Sometimes it's immediate, like I want to get through this week without quitting. Both are perfectly valid. And a useful question to that is, what do you want work to look like now? That phrase keeps the focus on the person's own priorities. If the person feels ownership of the goal, they're more likely to participate in the plan. Much like what Dr. Amador was talking about in the video and what the LEAP method sort of pushes us towards. Now, the first part of the shared job support plan is about starting with the person, not the problem. And so that means frankly, we don't begin with, here's what we're going to do, here's what you're doing wrong, essentially, or here's why you need services. We begin with what matters to the person. What do they want? What has helped them succeed before? What kind of work environment fits them best? And what supports have felt useful in the past? This matters because, frankly, folks, when the person is experiencing paranoia, the delusional thinking, or reduced insight that are hallmarks of a psychosis, they may already feel judged, watched, controlled, or just misunderstood. So you're starting with those emotions. And if our first move is to focus only on the problem, the person may just shut down or just become more defensive. So we start with strengths and preferences. Maybe the person has a strong work history. Maybe they're very reliable when they trust the environment. Maybe they do well with clear written instructions. Maybe they prefer quiet workspaces, predictable routines, or just private feedback. And then we move into functional impacts. This is where we ask, what gets harder when stress goes up? Not what symptoms are you having? Not do you understand that this is your mental health? Instead, we keep it practical. Functional impact might include missing shifts, avoiding interviews, getting conflict with coworkers, struggling to concentrate, feeling unsafe at work, suddenly, or quitting suddenly, or not answering calls from other providers or supervisors or case managers or whatnot. Overall, the goal is to identify what is interfering with employment without requiring the person to agree with a diagnosis or a clinical explanation. We're simply trying to understand what's making work harder and what might help. And so a useful framework is this, right? You can put this in your own words. I want to understand what helps you do well at work and then what tends to get in the way so we can build a plan that actually fits you. And that's key because we want to make sure that we are attending to them and to their needs. Now, the next part of the plan is about noticing what happens before things escalate. Okay, and on the screen here, I've started with early warning signs and sort of moving more over towards communication preferences. Now, a lot of the time, situations don't go from completely fine to crisis out of nowhere. In fact, in my experience, they rarely do. There are usually early warning signs. The person may start missing appointments, meetings. They may become more suspicious. They may stop answering calls. They may talk about quitting. They may describe feeling watched, targeted, unsafe, or unable to trust people at work. The important thing here is to use observable language. So instead of writing something like, the client's becoming psychotic, not that I think anybody would write that directly, but, just as an example, we might write something more akin to, the client missed 2 check-ins, reported feeling unsafe at work, and began talking about quitting. That kind of language is more respectful. It's more objective, and frankly, it's more useful for planning because then we look at triggers and stressors. Now, in employment settings, triggers are often practical things like sudden schedule changes, unclear instructions, public correction, loud environments, conflict with coworkers, or just feeling pressured. For example, let's say a person who already feels targeted may become more distressed if a supervisor corrects them in front of other people. A person who struggles with suspiciousness, frankly, may have a harder time when instructions are vague or when expectations change without warning. Now, finally, we want to make sure to identify communication preferences. This is a small thing that can make a huge difference, folks. Some people just do better with text messages because phone calls feel intrusive. Others misread texts, need direct conversation. Some people need written follow-up. Some need short check-ins. Some need space before problem solving. It could be almost anything. Now, a good question is this, though. When stress is high, what is the best way for me to communicate with you? Again, when stress is high, what is the best way for me to be able to communicate with you? That question really does two things. It gives us practical information and it communicates respect. Two things that can help us in this next phase, which is where things become a little more practical. Support strategies, team roles, and again, those best next steps that I was talking about. Support strategies should be fairly simple, realistic, and just low pressure, or as low pressure as we can make them. If the person is already mistrustful or just overwhelmed, a complicated plan may feel like another demand. And that's why I like framing supports as experiments, like I mentioned earlier. Instead of saying, you need to do this, right, we might say, would you be willing to try this for 1 week and then we can see if it helped? That gives the person some control. It sort of lowers the pressure. It also makes the plan easier to evaluate. And support strategies could include predictable check-ins, written task steps, private feedback, transportation planning, practicing a difficult conversation, maybe identifying a break plan or creating a plan for how to communicate with a supervisor. And then we can clarify team roles. And this is where we answer something like, who's doing what? What is the job seeker agreeing to try? What will the employment specialist do? Is there a supervisor involved? Is there a behavioral health provider involved? Does the person give consent for any communication? And as you all well know, consent is especially important. We really shouldn't share clinical information with employers without proper consent if we have it. And so we do communicate with employers, we keep it focused on work supports and job successes. And finally, every plan should end with one clear next step, not 10 steps, not a beautiful 3-page plan that nobody will use. And frankly, I'm personally more inclined to have a beautiful 3-page plan. I kind of like the detail, but it's not really practical, not for folks that we're talking about here. We really just want one next step. And so a good next step is small, it's specific, it's realistic, frankly, it's time limited and connected to the person's goal. For example, you could say something like, we'll do a text check-in in Tuesday at 10, right? Or we'll try a written task list for 1 week. Or maybe we'll practice what we want to say to your supervisor before Friday. Small steps work because they're doable. Again, they're doable, and frankly, if they're doable, they're realistic. And when the person completes one doable step, you have something to build on. One brick at a time. That's how you're building their confidence in the workplace. And as confidence increases, so does emotional resilience, and so does their willingness to stay in the moment and not feel detached from the moment, because that's a hallmark of somebody who might be experiencing a psychosis. So, on this slide, it's really just about knowing when the situation is moving beyond routine support employment. So, supported employment providers like yourself shouldn't be expected to manage serious safety concerns alone, right? As you all well know, I'm sure, that's just not your role. It's also not fair, right? Or, well, to yourselves or the person receiving services. So if there are threats of harm to self or others, severe agitation, threatening behavior, rapid worsening symptoms, inability to meet basic needs, major disruptions at work maybe, or just repeated loss of contact that raises concern, it's time to involve additional supports, right? And that might mean consulting with a supervisor, contacting a behavioral health provider, obviously with proper consent, a release of information form, that kind of thing, using crisis consultations, or just following emergency procedures if there's an imminent danger. Now, the key is to follow your agency's policy, local crisis procedures, whatnot, and don't improvise a crisis protocol in the middle of a crisis. I mean, frankly, I'm sure all of you know that very well, but just to say it out loud. And that usually goes about as well as assembling furniture without instructions, as I mentioned earlier.
Hey, folks, I'd just like you to remind, please mute yourself while you're in the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. But yeah, IKEA furniture. Also, one quick thing before we move on to the next slide, make sure to document clearly and objectively. We want to focus on what was observed, what was reported, what actions were taken, who was consulted, and what the next best step is. And overall, just the message I want to leave you with for this particular slide, for this particular section, is stay within your role. Don't ignore the risk, okay? Now, employer collaboration, as I'm sure you're all aware of, is very helpful, but it also has to be handled very carefully. Oops, went too far there. Now, the employer usually doesn't need clinical details or any details about the person's mental health. They need to know what helps the person succeed at work, though. So instead of saying, well, this person is paranoid, we might say something more akin to, this person does best with written instructions and private feedback. And so instead of saying they're experiencing delusions, it's better to probably say something like, clear expectations and predictable communication are helpful. This protects the person's dignity and privacy, frankly, while still giving the employer useful information. And a good rule is to share the least amount of information necessary to support job success and only with appropriate consent. Now, the focus, again, should stay on job tasks, communication needs, scheduling needs, training supports, feedback style, environmental supports, things like that. And this is also where supported employment staff like yourselves can be very effective. It can help translate a person's needs into practical workplace supports without unnecessarily exposing personal or clinical information in a particular way that might be intrusive, right? As it says there on the screen there, right, we have the focus and then the avoid. We want to focus on job tasks, those communication needs, and frankly, we can say private feedback and written instructions are helpful supports instead of saying this person's paranoid. All right. So with all that, apologies for all that background information. Hopefully you found it to be useful. I'm going to walk you through just a very brief case vignette of Jordan. Okay. Now, Jordan recently started a part-time job. Over the last 2 weeks, Jordan has missed 2 shifts, stopped responding to check-ins, reported feeling unsafe at work, and said the supervisor is sending signals to coworkers to make Jordan quit. Then Jordan says, "I'm not meeting with you anymore. You're probably part of it too. I don't need services. I need them to stop targeting me." Now, this is a really realistic stuck point, as I talked about at the beginning of this webinar. The provider might feel, you might feel defensive, worried, frustrated, or just unsure what to say. So before we talk about what to do, let's name what to avoid. We want to avoid saying, this is not happening. We want to avoid saying, you're paranoid. We want to avoid saying, you have to meet with me. We also want to avoid immediately contacting the employer without consent unless there's a serious safety issue that requires action under policies. So the first goal is not to correct Jordan. The first goal is to keep the door open. And with that, question for you. What should you, as the provider, as the case manager, avoid doing first? Right? Think about that question. You can put a few thoughts in the chat if you like. I just want to give you a brief moment to think about that. What should you avoid doing first? I mentioned a few of them, but is there anything else that comes to mind? Just going to give a brief pause, and I'm going to walk you through some suggestions. Good. Making demands, blaming or shaming or arguing, judging. Excellent. Excellent. Absolutely, Anthony. Yeah, 100%. No, you all are definitely on point. I appreciate that. Because here's one possible response, and there are several possible responses, folks. This is just one suggestion. You could say something like, Jordan, I can hear how stressful and upsetting this feels. I'm not experiencing the situation the same way, but I do believe that work has started to feel unsafe and exhausting for you. Now that part validates Jordan's distress without agreeing with the belief. Then you could say something like, I don't want to argue about what is true. I want to understand what would help you get through the next few days without losing the job, if keeping the job is still what you want. Now, that sentence is important because it gets us out of the debate and back into the employment goal. Because then we could say something like, would it be okay if we talk through one small next step? Because that there asks permission. It gives Jordan some control. It also keeps the next step small, doable, and, as I mentioned, realistic. Now, this response isn't magic, even though some people have told me it feels like magic when they do it. Jordan may still decline, but it's it's much less likely to escalate the situation than correcting, debating, or pushing services, right? You staying calm, validating emotion, avoiding reinforcement of belief, and redirecting toward a practical next step is key. And it involves all of the pieces of the LEAP method I mentioned: listening, empathizing, partnering, and agreeing. I realize I didn't put that exactly in the LEAP order. That actually spells something different. I should have swapped the agree and the P, but you get the point, right? All right, check the chat real quick. Thank you folks for your participation. Okay. So now that I've talked to you about how we might respond to Jordan in the moment, let's look at how we might turn that conversation into a practical plan. Now, this is where the sort of shared job support plan becomes useful. The purpose of this plan, mind you, is not to prove or disprove Jordan's belief. As I've mentioned several times now, we're not trying to write a clinical formulation. We're not diagnosing. We're not trying to force Jordan to agree with our view of the situation. The purpose is just simply to identify what Jordan wants, what is getting in the way, what support might help, and what the next step is. So let's walk through each part of this example as I sort of laid it out on the screen. Now, the first section here, right there in the middle, is that employment goal. And for Jordan, the goal might be keep the job if it feels manageable and safe. Now, that wording the way I just said that is very intentional. We're not saying Jordan needs to stop believing the supervisor is targeting him. That might be, well, that might be what we hope improves, certainly, but it's not the language we need for an employment support plan. Instead, we're anchoring the plan to something Jordan may actually agree with: keeping the job, feeling safe enough to continue, and having more control over what happens next. Very good, Brianna. Thank you. Right. So this is important because when someone is experiencing paranoia or delusional thinking, well, they may not agree with us about why the situation is happening, but they may still agree on what they want. They want, maybe they want income. Maybe they want stability. Maybe they want to avoid quitting suddenly. Uh, they may want to feel respected. They may want to get through the next shift without conflict. And they may want all of that, right? And that shared goal is where we build the plan. And so we start right there up at the top in blue in that next section of strengths and preferences. For Jordan, we might write something like wants steady income, prefers direct communication, does better with predictable expectations. Now, this helps us remember that Jordan is not just a problem to manage. Jordan is a person with goals, preferences, strengths. Maybe Jordan has been successful in jobs before. Maybe Jordan is reliable when expectations are clear. Maybe Jordan responds better when communication is direct and private. Maybe Jordan doesn't do well when feedback feels vague or public. These details matter because they tell us how to support the person more effectively. Okay? For example, let's say if a person tends to become more suspicious when instructions are vague, one support might be written expectations. If a person feels embarrassed or threatened when corrected in front of others, one support might be private feedback. If a person struggles when schedule changes happen very suddenly, one support might be advance notice whenever possible. Now, that flexibility there is key, right? We can't predict every single little thing, but if we can reduce the occurrence of it, it can become more tolerable and add to the person's resilience. Now, that being said, though, that leads us right into the functional impact. So for Jordan, the functional impact is basically, missed shifts, fear at work, mistrust of supervisor, avoiding provider contact, that kind of thing. Now, notice that this language is concrete and employment focused. We're not writing Jordan is psychotic or Jordan is delusional or Jordan is refusing services because he lacks insight, even if those things are clinically relevant. They're not the most helpful way to frame the support plan. So instead, we're asking, what is actually happening that affects work? Just double checking the chat. Thank you both. I think it would depend on the tone and context I like to talk. Absolutely. Saying something I'm just trying to help can come off as defensive. And, also I'm sure this is probably resonates for everybody here. It's not necessarily what we say, it's also how we say it that can make the most impact. But let's go ahead and go through keep going through this. Now, as I mentioned, right, we're asking what is actually happening that affects work. Jordan is missing shifts, feels unsafe for work, that kind of thing. This is really an important shift. In support employment, we often don't need agreement on the diagnosis to make progress. In fact, that's kind of ancillary. We need agreement on the goal and the barrier. The person may not agree that their belief is inaccurate, but they may agree that missing shifts is putting the job at risk. They may agree that stress is making work harder. They may agree that, quitting suddenly could create problems for them. And that gives us room to work. Because next, we have early warning signs and stressors. So for Jordan, this might include, say, like increased suspicion, missed shifts, uh, quitting talk, public correction, unclear expectations, that kind of thing. And really, this part helps us think preventively, okay? Because we want to be proactive as much as possible. So we're asking, what tends to happen before things get worse? Maybe Jordan starts saying, well, I'm done with this job. Maybe Jordan stops answering calls. Maybe Jordan becomes more focused on the supervisor's intentions. Maybe Jordan misses a shift after a difficult interaction. Maybe Jordan becomes more distressed when feedback happens in front of coworkers, that kind of thing. And again, we want to use observable language. So instead of saying something like, well, let's go real robotic, like Jordan is decompensating, we can say Jordan has missed 2 shifts. Maybe Jordan has missed 2 shifts and is reporting feeling unsafe and is talking about quitting. That language is frankly clear, it's a lot less stigmatizing, and easier for a team, regardless of their specialty, to be able to respond to. Because then we can move forward and identify support strategies that really resonate with Jordan. And for Jordan, possible strategies might include private check-ins, a written plan, supervisor communication with consent, 1 week schedule reviews. These are practical. They're not huge. They're not framed as Jordan must accept treatment before we can help. They're employment supports that might reduce stress and improve follow-through. So, for example, let's say a private check-in may help Jordan feel less exposed. A written plan may reduce confusion. Supervisor communication may help clarify expectations, but only with Jordan's consent. A 1 week schedule review may help Jordan feel more prepared and just less caught off guard. And then finally, we end with that best next step. For Jordan, the next step hopefully is one short check-in tomorrow to decide whether Jordan wants help planning for the next shift. That is small on purpose again. When someone is mistrustful or overwhelmed, a large plan can feel like pressure. A small next step feels more doable and realistic, as I mentioned. And we're not asking Jordan to agree with everything. We're just asking Jordan to stay connected long enough to consider that next step.
I have a question about the other.
I'm sorry, if you have a question, could you put it in the chat? I couldn't quite hear. And I'll make sure to give time at the end too. Of course. Thank you for being here, Eric.
Thank you. Okay.
Hey, Jenna, do you have a question for Nick? If you could hold that to the end of the presentation, that would be helpful. If you have any questions, folks, please put that in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we're going to practice and apply this, right? The scenario on this slide basically says, and it's right there in the center, hopefully it's readable, the interview is fake. They already know everything about me because people have been tracking me online. I'm not going. Now, this kind of statement can immediately pull us into correction mode. A very natural response might be, no one is tracking you, or that's not true, or you're overthinking this. And I understand why that happens, right? We want to reassure the person. We want to help them get the interview. We want to reduce the fear. But in the moment, that kind of correction can easily backfire. The person may feel dismissed, judged, or even more convinced that we don't understand what is actually happening. And so for this activity, for this framework, I want us to slow it down. Okay? First, ask, what feeling might be underneath this? Starting there at that left-hand side upper quadrant there. Okay? The person might be scared. Maybe they feel exposed. Maybe they feel embarrassed. Maybe they feel unsafe. Maybe they feel like they don't have any control. Or just maybe they may be worried that the interview is not really an opportunity, but it's a setup. And that feeling is what we can respond to. In fact, if you hear from a client that, I was having these thoughts, these paranoid thoughts, but I chose to tell myself that everything is okay, that's where you're making progress. And I've heard that before. Hopefully all of you have heard it too, or will. Now, from the feeling piece, there's a second piece, like, what should the provider avoid saying? We want to avoid statements like, this is not real. You're being paranoid. You need to go anyway, or you're going to ruin this opportunity. Even if we're trying to be helpful, those responses can create a power struggle. So we want to avoid over reassurance, if that makes sense. And sometimes we say, I promise no one's tracking you, for example. But if the person doesn't trust that reassurance, we may end up repeating ourselves over and over again. And at that point, the conversation becomes a debate. So we want to be real careful about that. The third thing we want to try to ask is, what could a provider say instead, right? A helpful response could be something like this. I can hear that this feels really unsafe and overwhelming. I'm not seeing the interview the same way, but I want to understand what would make the next step feel more manageable for you. That response does a few things, really. It validates the distress. It doesn't agree with the belief. It gently states that we don't see it the same way, and it shifts toward planning. So another possible response might be something like this, like, it sounds like the idea of going into that interview feels really uncomfortable right now. I don't want to argue about whether the interview is fake. I want to understand whether there's any part of the plan that would help you feel more prepared or just more in control. Or maybe another option might be, I hear that you don't feel safe right now. Would it help to look together at what you know about the employer, who you're meeting with, and what choices you still have? Again, the tone matters. We want to sound calm, not sarcastic, curious, not dismissive, supportive, not forceful. Sometimes it takes a little bit of practice in front of a mirror, to be honest with you, but I promise you it's possible. And then finally, we want to ask, what shared goal could we or you identify? The shared goal might be employment. Again, it might be income. It might be wanting to make a good decision. It might be wanting to avoid embarrassment. It might be wanting to stay in control. Maybe it's wanting to not lose progress, which is completely valid. So you might say something like this. It sounds like you still want to work, but this interview doesn't feel safe right now. Can we focus on what would help you make the best decision for your work goals? That allows you to connect with the person's goal without sort of debating the belief. And then we can also ask this, like, what's the next best step? This is where we want to stay realistic. One small step might be reviewing the interview details together. Another might be practicing what the person wants to say. Another might be contacting the employer to confirm the interview details if the person agrees. Another might be rescheduling the interview, or might be doing a 5-minute check-in before the interview. Or another might be deciding not to go today, but making a plan to revisit the job goal tomorrow. The important thing is that the next step, the next best step, shouldn't feel like an ultimatum. Instead of saying something like, you have to go, we might say something like, would you be willing to spend 5 minutes looking at the options before making a final decision? And that's often more effective and reflective. So for the practice, right, I want you to think about these questions to yourself for a moment. What is the feeling underneath this? What should we avoid saying? What could we say instead? What shared goal could we identify? What's one small next step? Okay? Those are the questions I want you to think about for a moment, especially concerning this particular scenario you see in the middle of the screen here. Because, right, hopefully you were able to think about what feeling could possibly be underneath. There are plenty of different ways you could have approached this with fear. Maybe they felt exposed. Maybe they mistrusted somebody. Maybe they felt unsafe, right? Maybe they were trying to avoid arguing, feeling dismissed, being labeled, right? All of these things matter. Now, in the handout that I'm hopefully you'll get after, not hopefully you will get after this, I've laid these steps out pretty clearly, as well as given you space on the worksheet to practice this on your own as well. With that, this slide takes us a next step further. It gives us really two main things. Now, we have right there, we have what to watch out for, and then what to ask ourselves, right? Now, one of the things that we want to avoid is debating reality, right? That's kind of part of like the pitfalls, for lack of a better way of putting it. This is probably the easiest trap to fall into. The person says something that seems clearly inaccurate and we want to correct it. Again, that instinct makes sense, right? But when someone is experiencing paranoia or delusional thinking, debating reality often turns the conversation into a power struggle. For example, if the person says, my coworkers are plotting against me, and we respond with, no, they're not, the person may not feel reassured. They may feel dismissed. And so they may think we're taking the coworker's side. They may become even more guarded. Honestly, a more helpful response might be something like, I can hear that work feels really unsafe right now. I'm not seeing it the same way, but I want to understand what is making the workday feel so difficult. Now that response avoids the debate and keeps the conversation open. Now, the second piece is over-explaining or just moving too fast. When we're uncomfortable, we sometimes talk more. We give more details. We try to reassure. We try to solve. We try to fix as fast as possible. Think of it as like a defense mechanism in overdrive, okay? Now, when someone is already suspicious or overwhelmed, too many words can make things just worse and can feel like pressure. For example, maybe imagine saying something like this. No, no, no. The employer is legitimate. I checked the website. I talked to the manager. They've been around for years, and there's no reason to think this is fake. Now, that may be factually accurate, sure, but it also may not land pretty well. And so think of it like this. A shorter response could be better. Like, I hear this really doesn't feel safe right now. Would it help to look at the interview details together before deciding what to do? Check that. Maybe they want to flip the script and create a couple of interview questions to the employer. Yeah, I like that, Patty. Again, let's go to one of the next things to watch out for, which is taking accusations personally. And that's a tough one. If someone says you're part of this or you're working with them, it can feel very personal. It can feel unfair. And, well, depending on the day, it can really push buttons. If we respond defensively, we usually escalate the situation. So instead of saying something like, I've done nothing but help you, we might say something like, I hear this is hard to trust me right now. I'm not here to pressure you. I don't I do want to support your work goal if you're open to talking about one next best step. That keeps the focus on trust and choice. Mind you, I said it that way. I encourage you to put it into your own words, keeping that same tone and that same basic structure. Now, the fourth thing I want you to notice is making the plan too large and sharing just too much with employers or just ignoring risks. This isn't something that anybody intends to do going into it. It's just something that just unfortunately happens sometimes. And, these are grouped together because they all involve overstepping or just missing the mark. And so a plan that's too large can overwhelm a person. Sharing too much with an employer can violate trust and privacy. Ignoring risk can leave the provider and the person just unsupported. So we want to stay balanced. We want to keep the plan small and share only what we absolutely have to with the employer, and of course with consent. Right? Now, let's move over to the right-hand side there. I want to talk to you a little bit about what to ask yourself, essentially the decision guide piece of it. Okay? Now, let's take a look at this from a certain standpoint, because the decision guide at the end of the day, right, is something that we use to ensure that everything is staying on track. So the first question is there an immediate safety concern? This always comes first. There's an immediate risk of harm to self or others, severe agitation maybe, threatening behavior, or another immediate safety issue. We want to follow agency policies and crisis procedures, whatever they might be. We don't try to handle that alone. The second question is also this, is this within my role? This is important because support employment providers can do a lot. They're not expected to do everything, though. If the issue is about job supports, okay, cool. Maybe communication, planning, coaching, or workplace needs, that can be within the appropriate role. So if it moves into clinical treatment, risk assessment, medication diagnosis, risk crisis intervention, that requires appropriate, partnering. And so with that in mind, that kind of leads us into the next piece. What is the person's employment goal, and what feeling or concern is getting in the way right now? Now, this can help us stay grounded. The person's goal might be to keep a job, applying for work, avoid quitting, feeling safer at work, that kind of thing, or to communicate better with a supervisor or coworkers, in fact. And the feeling getting in the way might be fear, shame, suspicion, anger, just confusion, folks. And so once we know the goal and the feeling, we can respond more skillfully, right? Because then we have the final piece there, like what can I validate and what is one small next step? And who else may be involved? This is the action question. Like, think of it like this. What can I validate? Usually the emotion. What's one small best next step? Hopefully something specific, doable, and realistic. Who else needs to be involved? Well, maybe it's a supervisor. Maybe it's a behavioral health provider. Maybe it's a crisis line. Maybe it's an employer of another kind, or a care team member. Now, depending on consent, role, and risk, these can all be possible. Now, I want you to think of this all right here as a way of pausing things. When the conversation gets to be too intense, especially with somebody that's going off on a tangent, feeling like they're spiraling, the things that you need to do is just pause to yourself and ask, is there risk? Is what I'm talking about within my role? What is my goal right now? And what is the feeling I'm seeing? What can I validate? What's one small best next step? And who else needs to be involved? That structure, I promise you, helps prevent us from reacting too quickly. For example, let's apply this real quick. Let's say a person says, I'm not going back to that job, and the manager's trying to poison me, right? The first question is there an immediate safety concern? Are they threatening harm? Are they in danger? Is anyone else in danger? If yes, cool. Follow crisis procedures. Now, the second question then, as I mentioned, is this within my role? Well, I can't treat that belief, but I can support the employment impact, right? Cool. Now, the next question, or the third question, is what is the goal? Maybe the person wanted to keep the job. What is the feeling? Fear, maybe feeling unsafe. Okay. Then the fourth question that I mentioned, what can I validate? That sounds terrifying. What's one next step? Would you be willing to talk through what would help you feel safe enough to decide what to do about work tomorrow? Or what else may be involved, right? That's the next piece. Because depending on the situation, behavioral health or crisis support may need to be consulted in this situation. And that is how we use this framework here, this guide, to de-escalate a potentially escalating situation. Remember, we can't force them to feel grounded, to come back to the shared reality that we all have. But we can make it easier for them to bring themselves down. Teach somebody to fish. Don't fish for them, kind of thing. Now, moving a little bit further, as I start to wrap this up, right, I want to bring us back to the key takeaways. And so the first takeaway here that I want to emphasize is restraint. Don't argue with delusional content, guys. That doesn't mean we agree with it, right? It just means we don't make the belief the battleground. If someone says my supervisor is sending secret messages about me, well, we don't need to say, yes, that's happening, but we also don't need to start with, no, that's impossible. And so we want to frame it sort of like this, like I can hear that this feels really stressful. I'm not seeing it the same way, but I want to understand how it's affecting your work and what might help. That keeps us out of the debate. Because the second takeaway that I want you to have is validation. Again, as I talked about earlier, validate feelings without reinforcing inaccurate beliefs. This is a really core skill. We can validate fear. We can, in fact, validate stress. We can validate frustration. We can validate the desire to feel safe. We can validate that work feels overwhelming. We do not need to validate the belief itself. For example, I can understand why you would want to avoid work if it feels unsafe. That's really different from, yes, your coworkers are definitely plotting against you, right? The first response validates the feeling. The second reinforces the belief, okay? Now, the third takeaway is function. Now, focus on function and goals. Sometimes it's hard to do when you're working with clients experiencing a psychosis. And this is, frankly, especially important. We want, well, I'll put it like this. We may not be able to get agreement on what is causing the problem, but we may be able to get agreement on what is happening functionally. Are shifts being missed? Is the person avoiding interviews? Is conflict increasing? Is the person thinking about quitting? Is the person losing contact with providers? Is the person still interested in working? Function and goals really give us something practical to work with. And the fourth takeaway is partnership. Really kind of leans into that lead method. Again, listen, empathize, agree, and partner. That gives us structure because listening, again, means we slow down and try to understand. Empathize means we respond with feeling. Agree means we find shared ground, right? And then partner means we identify just one best next step together, right? In partnership. Now, this doesn't have to sound scripted, right? It could be very natural. You could say something like, tell me what's been going on. That sounds exhausting. I think we both want to feel safe and keep a job, right? So if that's still what you want, let's figure this out. Would you be willing to talk through one option tomorrow? That's the LEAP framework, just straight up, right? Now, from partnership, we have simplicity. Simplicity. If somebody's already starting to feel detached from reality, right, experiencing a psychosis, simplicity makes it a lot easier for them to make sense of things and bring them back down to baseline, right? So keep supports small and practical. When someone is overwhelmed or mistrustful, a big plan can feel impossible. So instead of saying, here are 10 things you need to do, a better way of putting it is, what's one thing you'd be willing to try this week? Small supports might include short check-ins, a written reminder, a practice conversation, a schedule review, a break plan, or a text before a shift. Now, the sixth takeaway there at the bottom is safety. And this involves additional supports when risk increases. And so supported employment staff shouldn't manage serious safety concerns alone. If there are threats of harm, severe agitation, rapid worsening, inability to meet basic needs, or concerns beyond your role or the people around you, again, follow policy, involve the appropriate supports, and so on. Now, all that being said, I want you to sit with, well, what I think is a good reflection for a moment. When a person is scared, suspicious, or declining support, the goal is not to win the argument. That can be hard because sometimes the belief is clearly inaccurate. And in our roles as helpers, regardless of our specific job duties, we often want to correct it. But if winning the argument costs us the relationship, we may lose the ability to help at all. And so remember, the goal is to preserve trust, reduce harm, keep the door open for the next helpful step. And sometimes the next helpful step is not dramatic. It can be one check-in. It can be the person agreeing not to quit tomorrow. It can just be reviewing the schedule together. Maybe it's getting consent to coordinate with a provider. Maybe it may be simply ending the conversation in a way that makes it more likely the person will answer the phone next time. Those small steps matter because they build on one another. And in your type of work, in supported employment, connection is often the bridge to everything else, right? If we preserve that connection, we preserve opportunity. Opportunity for planning, opportunity for support, opportunity for safety, frankly, opportunity for the person to stay connected to work and to their own goals. Okay. Now, all of this is to say, right? Well, yeah. Let's talk a little bit about this next piece, and we'll kind of bring this together and kind of open it up for any questions there might be, right? Now, I want to keep this discussion really practical. There are a few things that I want you to consider, right? And there are a few prompts there, starting with 1 through 5. And as we talk through these questions on the screen, I want to keep the discussion practical, right? Now, a few prompts that might help in situations working with individuals who may be experiencing a psychosis might be, what situations feel most difficult in your role? Maybe it's when someone accuses you of being part of the problem. Maybe it's when someone stops answering calls. Maybe it's when the person wants to quit suddenly. Maybe it's when the employer is frustrated and wants an immediate answer. Okay. Next piece, or the next question, where do conversations usually get stuck? Do they get stuck when you try to discuss the workplace concern? Do they get stuck when the person refuses services? Do they get stuck when the person doesn't want anyone contacting the employer? Or maybe do they get stuck when safety concerns start coming up? That helps you better understand triggers and escalation points. The next piece is like what scripts feel most useful. Yeah, it's the language piece. I just talked about challenges, barriers. Now I'm talking about language. And language matters because sometimes the most helpful thing from any training is just one sentence you can actually use. Maybe it's, I can hear how stressful this feels, or I'm not seeing it that way, but I want to understand how it is affecting you. Or I don't want to argue about what is true. I want to help you move towards your goal. What is one step that would feel manageable today? Now, all that being said, next piece is what parts of the shared job support plan could fit your workflow. Maybe your team already has a planning document and you can add functional impact, early warning signs, or communication preferences. Maybe you don't need a brand new form. Maybe you just need a better planning or better planning questions. Okay? And that's integration. Again, challenges, barriers, language, integration, and then finally, safety. And this is probably the most important piece. All staff, all providers, whatever your role might be, we need to know who to call, who to consult, and what to document, and what agency to process is. So no one should feel like they're carrying high-risk situations alone. So that said, though, we want to make sure that we are integrating everybody into the collaboration process. So, for example, let's say, what if a person keeps insisting the belief is true, right? That's a really common situation. The goal is not to keep repeating that you disagree. You can acknowledge once and that you're not seeing it the same way, and then shift back the feeling and the functional impact. Now, everything I've talked about today is going to be in the handout that I'm going to hopefully going to be emailed to you. It's going to provide all the structure that I talked about today, as well as details on the LEAP method and how to work with individuals who might be experiencing a psychosis at the moment. But before we wrap up here, I want to open it up for any questions. Does anybody have any questions? Anything that comes to mind that they want to share, either just a thought or anything else? Just a brief moment. So Lorraine in the chat is, why do you think / feel that? Helpful, or does it feed into a problem later? I actually like that question. Like, because it asks them to sort of look back and be introspective of their thought process. I would probably frame it in terms of like, okay, well, why do you feel that way? Like, help me understand. We want to make sure we're adding the correct modifiers there. So it feels as though that the person is understanding that they're not being accused. They're simply being asked to explain further. So no, I don't think that would feed into the problem later. Great question. Workplace trauma question. Thank you, Megan. Let me see if I can go like with that.
I put it right below in the chat.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's see here. Oh, I don't see it. Let me go back up.
Sammy put it there close to the bottom.
I think I see here. What if you have these thoughts and feelings due to serious workplace trauma where your supervisor was trying to get you fired, your job was always on the line, if everything wasn't perfect, you continually receive mixed rules, messages thrown at you. I could provide a list of experiences that I know this is exactly what is happening.
I obviously have no personal experience with this at all in any way, shape, or form.
I know what you mean. So this is a really good question for one, and it's also a really tricky one because some of the things that people get paranoid about aren't necessarily not based on real experiences. Oftentimes, like when it comes to trauma, especially, it can feel like they're re-experiencing the same situation again. Fun little quick side note, like the connection between the amygdala, the hippocampus in the brain, and our frontal cortex here. Information comes in, the hippocampus is trying to make sense of like, is this happening now? Was this happening before? And the amygdala is just firing off, be like, ooh, this feels like the same thing. This feels like the same thing. This feels like the same thing. And that's the piece where you can be helpful. If we're working with somebody who feels like that this situation is exactly going to happen again, then we want them to lay it out. We want them to talk about it. If it feels the same, great. If it doesn't feel the same, okay. Is it possible it doesn't feel the same? And truthfully, when it comes to trauma impacts and somebody with a trauma history around employment, it's very important that we don't push too hard. We only push as far as they're willing to go. And so asking questions like, is this exactly the same as before? Like, help me understand the key differences, if there are any. There are no differences. Okay. All right. Well, then I agree with you, and like we'll proceed with that edict, that conclusion. All of that being said is we truthfully want to 100% avoid re-traumatizing somebody. We just hard stop, because that we can only make it worse if we try to make somebody feel like the situation is good, even though they're feeling something different. Does that answer your question? Can I clarify it any further?
No, that was good. Thank you.
Of course. All right, any other questions? Anything else I can answer? Well,
Can
folks,
I-
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Nick, I
Yeah.
was just going to bring up something that I've heard recently from one of our providers that, like, how would you suggest handling a situation where the goals are grandiose and not achievable? Like, how would you help work with a care plan for somebody who, say, wants to be God because they have delusions that they're, I mean, I know that for me, I would personally go like simple steps first, like, okay, have you thought about a degree in theology or, I mean, those kinds of things. But how would you kind of guide them into a more realistic goal if their goals are very grandiose or not necessarily achievable?
I I would start, and this might sound a little strange, but bear with me. I would usually point them towards a particular area, like you mentioned theology. Okay, let's say for example they do want to be like God. They want to be on top of the world. They want to be a millionaire or a billionaire. Great. Where? What in what area? Um, let's say it's IT. Let's say it's in information technology. Okay, cool. Um, what do you like about it? Okay, well, maybe I like all the control. I like being able to see what people are doing. Cool. Is there any part of that where we can start, where we can build you up toward that? And that's the thing, right? We 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 don't want to challenge that belief. Their thoughts are going to be grandiose. I once had a client who who wholeheartedly believed that they were the second coming, that they were able to see into the future, and that they had all this deep insight into that. Now, did I challenge those beliefs? No. Did I use those beliefs in a way to point them in a direction that would be useful for them and practical for them? Yes. Because the truth of the matter is, like life, and as we all know, like there are barriers that keep people from like moving up in a certain way. And what we want to do is we want to point somebody in a particular direction, keep their keep their expectations clear, even if they have beliefs of something bigger. We all think of it like this. We all have deep dreams. We all have things that we deeply want. And maybe as we get older, we sort of like think, well, maybe that's not going to really happen. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with holding those beliefs at the heart of it. If we can keep somebody feeling safe along the way, those grandiose beliefs will start to diminish. Now, mind you, if we're talking about somebody with a severe psychiatric illness, obviously we're also talking about hopefully proper supports, psychiatric interventions, medication therapy, whatever it might be the most appropriate for the case. But pointing them in a direction that helps them, that looks practical for them, even if it's starting at the bottom of the ladder and working their way up. But it's all about like, if I want to be God, great. What what part of the world do you want to control the most? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah. So just taking it into smaller steps, more practical when it's a really grandiose idea, just kind of breaking it down into something that's a little bit more practical, something that can be like not saying you can't be God, but instead, like you said, taking it into something smaller, like what
And
appeals to you about being God and
that
what
part,
can we
yes.
actually do? Yeah.
Yes, that
Okay.
part, absolutely. All right. Any other questions? See if there's any in the chat. Don't see any. Well, I'm glad it applies to housing as well. Thank you. Thank you, Patty. I will say from a practical standpoint and just a realistic standpoint,